In the grand manor of St. Mary Mead, a summit for peace turns deadly when Ambassador Victor Renaud is found strangled with a silk scarf. Amid whispers of betrayal, Miss Jane Marple unravels a web of motives. Clara's strained loyalty, Dimitri's hidden secrets, Sir Harold's ruthless ambition, and Eliza's fiery zeal. As alibis crumble and clues, ink smudges, muddy boots, a floral-scented scarf point to the truth, Miss Marple sets a trap, revealing a desperate act to sabotage the summit. In just 30 seconds, dive into a classic Agatha Christie mystery where passion and deception collide, and one sharp mind sees all. Chapter 1. The Summit's Shadow. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the cobbled lanes of St. Mary Mead, a village that seemed to doze in eternal tranquility, yet today buzzed with an unfamiliar energy. The grand manor of Lord Ashby, perched on the hill like a stern matriarch, had been transformed into a stage for an international summit, a rare intrusion of the world's clamor into this quiet corner of England. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her parlor window, her fingers deftly working her knitting needles, observed the scene with her usual keen eye. The click of her needles was a soft metronome to her thoughts, which darted like sparrows among the arriving motor cars, their polished chrome glinting in the golden light. The summit, a delicate negotiation to broker peace between two nations long at odds, had drawn a constellation of dignitaries to the manor. Chief among them was Ambassador Victor Renaud, a man whose reputation preceded him like a fanfare. His silver hair and commanding presence made him unmistakable as he stepped from his car, his smile both gracious and guarded. Miss Marple, invited as a guest of Lady Ashby, a distant cousin with a penchant for hosting grand affairs, watched him pause to survey the manor's ivy-clad facade. A man accustomed to power, she mused, but not without enemies. The day wore on with the hum of preparation, footmen scurrying with trays, maids whispering in corners, and the faint clink of crystal as the dining hall was readied. Miss Marple, ensconced in a velvet armchair in the manor's drawing room, sipped her tea and listened. The air was thick with anticipation, but beneath it lay a current of unease, like a melody played in a minor key. She noted the stiff postures of the summit's aides, the forced laughter of diplomats, and the occasional sharp glance exchanged in the corridors. People are never so guarded, she thought, as when they have something to hide. By evening, the manor glowed with lamplight, and the summit's opening dinner was underway. Miss Marple, seated at the far end of the table, observed the guests. Clara Henshaw, the ambassador's aide, her eyes darting nervously to Renaud. Dmitri Volkov, the translator, his thin fingers tapping an impatient rhythm. Sir Harold Bryce, a rival diplomat, whose polished charm seemed to mask a restless ambition. And outside, glimpsed through the tall windows, a cluster of protesters, their placards bobbing in the dusk. One figure, a young woman with fierce eyes, stood out, later identified as Eliza Kane, a known agitator against the summit's aims. Dinner concluded, and the guests dispersed to their suites or to quiet corners for murmured discussions. Miss Marple, retiring to her room, paused by the grand staircase, her hand resting lightly on the banister. The manor's silence was profound, yet it felt like the hush before a storm. At precisely 10:15, that silence shattered. A scream, high and piercing, echoed from the west wing, followed by a thud that seemed to reverberate through the oak-paneled walls. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her step was steady as she followed the commotion. In the ambassador's suite, a scene of horror awaited. Victor Renaud lay sprawled on the Persian rug, his face a ghastly shade, a silk scarf knotted tightly around his neck. His eyes, wide and unseeing, stared at the chandelier above. Lady Ashby, pale as her lace gown, stood frozen in the doorway, while a footman stammered for the police. Inspector Crane, a man of methodical calm, arrived swiftly, his notebook already open. "Strangulation," he declared after a brief examination, his voice clipped. "No sign of a struggle beyond the scarf. Time of death, likely within the hour." Miss Marple, permitted to linger as a family friend, took in the room's details. The untouched decanter of brandy, the open window letting in a cool breeze, the ambassador's papers neatly stacked, save for one sheet slightly askew. Her gaze settled on the scarf, its intricate pattern shimmering faintly in the lamplight. "Not a common design," she murmured to herself, her mind already sifting through the possibilities. The inspector named 4 suspects: Clara, who had been closest to Renaud; Dimitri, whose access was unrivaled; Sir Harold, whose rivalry was well known; and Eliza, who had been seen lurking near the manor's grounds. As the police cordoned off the suite, Miss Marple returned to her armchair, her knitting resumed. The manor's grandeur seemed dimmed, its walls now holding a secret. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a village squabble once revealed a murderer through a misplaced hairpin. "The truth," she said softly, her needles clicking, "is always in the smallest things." The summit's shadow had darkened, and Miss Marple knew the threads of this mystery would unravel only through patience and observation. Chapter 2. The Aide's Devotion. The morning after Ambassador Victor Renaud's murder dawned over St. Mary Mead with a deceptive serenity, the sun filtering through the manor's tall windows to cast dappled patterns on the polished oak floors. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room of Lord Ashby's manor, sipped her tea with deliberate calm, her knitting needles resting momentarily in her lap. The air was heavy with the aftermath of tragedy, the summit's delegates moving about with hushed voices and furtive glances. Yet Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp beneath their gentle exterior, missed nothing. The click of her teaspoon against the saucer was the only sound she permitted herself as she observed the gathering storm of suspicion. Inspector Crane, a man whose methodical nature bordered on the mechanical, had set up a temporary office in the manor's library, a room lined with leather-bound volumes and smelling faintly of old paper and wax. He had begun his interrogations with Clara Henshaw, the ambassador's aide, whose devotion to her employer had been the talk of the summit's staff. Miss Marple, invited to linger as a discreet observer by Lady Ashby, took a seat near the library's hearth, her presence unobtrusive yet keenly felt. Clara entered, her slim figure clad in a navy skirt and blouse, her auburn hair pinned tightly as if to hold her composure in place. Her hands, however, betrayed her, trembling slightly as she clasped them before her. "Miss Henshaw," Inspector Crane began, his voice clipped but not unkind. "You were Ambassador Renaud's aide for 3 years. A trusted confidant, I understand. Where were you last night between 9 and 10:15? Clara's lips parted, then closed, as if measuring her words. "In my room," she said at last, her voice steady but soft. "I was organizing the ambassador's schedule for the next day. He had meetings planned, delicate ones. I worked alone, as I often did." Miss Marple, her fingers resuming their gentle rhythm with the knitting needles, noted the faint crease in Clara's blouse, a detail at odds with her otherwise meticulous appearance. The blouse, crisp and freshly pressed, bore a single line across the shoulder, as if it had been folded hastily and then worn in a rush. A woman so precise, Miss Marple thought, would not overlook such a flaw unless her mind was elsewhere. She said nothing, but her gaze lingered on Clara's hands, which now clutched a small notebook, its edges worn from frequent handling. Inspector Crane leaned forward, his pen poised over his notebook. "Alone, you say? Can anyone confirm this? A maid, perhaps, or another guest?" Clara's cheeks flushed faintly, but her eyes held steady. "No, Inspector. The manner was quiet. I heard nothing until the scream." Her voice faltered on the last word, and she pressed her lips together as if to seal in her grief. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her mind turning to a memory of Mrs. Bantry's housemaid, who had once concealed a lover's quarrel behind a tearful alibi. Grief, Miss Marple knew, could be genuine, yet still a mask. "Miss Henshaw," she interjected gently, her tone as mild as a summer breeze. "You must have been very close to the ambassador. Such devotion is rare. Did he ever confide in you about threats, perhaps? Or enemies?" Clara's eyes flickered, a shadow crossing her face. "He was a great man," she said, her voice rising slightly. "A visionary. But great men have enemies, don't they? He never spoke of specifics, only that the summit was delicate. He trusted me to keep his papers in order, his secrets safe." She clutched the notebook tighter, her knuckles whitening. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly concern, but her mind was elsewhere. The notebook, she noted, was not the standard issue provided to the summit's staff. Its leather cover bore a faint monogram, too worn to read clearly. Secrets, she thought, are heavy burdens for the devoted. She recalled a village seamstress who had hoarded love letters, not out of betrayal, but out of a desperate loyalty that turned to obsession. Could Clara's devotion hide a similar weight? Inspector Crane pressed on, his questions methodical but relentless. "You had access to the ambassador's suite, did you not? His papers, his rooms, everything passed through your hands." Clara nodded, her posture stiffening. "Yes, but I was never in his suite after dinner. I swear it. My work was done in my own room, across the hall." Her voice held a note of defiance now, as if daring the inspector to doubt her. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to the tension in the room. She noticed a faint smudge on Clara's cuff, barely visible against the navy fabric, a trace of ink, perhaps, or something darker. Curious, she thought, for a woman who claims to have spent the evening writing. Ink was common enough, but the smudge's placement suggested a hurried gesture, not the careful work of a secretary. She made a mental note to inquire about the Manor's writing desks, their inkwells, their quirks. As the interrogation drew to a close, Clara rose, her movements graceful but strained. "If there's nothing else, Inspector, I have duties to attend to. The summit must go on for the ambassador's sake." Her voice broke slightly, and she turned away, her shoulders squared as if bracing for a storm. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind sifting through the details like a gardener turning soil. Clara's devotion was palpable, but devotion, she knew, could curdle into something darker. Resentment, perhaps, or betrayal born of unrequited loyalty. She thought of the vicar's wife in St. Mary Mead, who had once defended her husband's honor so fiercely that she overlooked his flaws, until those flaws led to ruin. Loyalty, Miss Marple murmured to herself. is a double-edged blade. Later that morning, Miss Marple took a turn about the manor's grounds, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel paths. The air was crisp, scented with late roses and the faint tang of wood smoke from the village. She paused by the rose garden, where a young gardener clipped thorns with a distracted air. "Good morning, Tom," she said brightly, recognizing the lad from St. Mary Mead. "You've been busy with all these visitors, I imagine." Tom nodded, wiping his brow. "Aye, Miss Marple. Too many comings and goings for my liking. Saw that aide, Miss Henshaw, out here last night before all the trouble. Looked right upset, she did, pacing by the fountain." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. "Upset, you say? Before the scream?" "Aye, around 9, maybe a bit after." She was muttering to herself, clutching that notebook of hers. "Didn't see me, I reckon. I was trimming the hedges by the west gate." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind alight with this new piece of the puzzle. Clara had claimed to be in her room, yet here was evidence of her wandering the grounds, agitated, before the murder. The fountain was near the west wing, not far from the ambassador's suite. A woman pacing, she thought. Is a woman wrestling with something, guilt, fear, or perhaps a decision? Returning to the manor, Miss Marple sought out Lady Ashby, who was overseeing the rearrangement of the dining hall for the summit's continuation. "My dear Jane," Lady Ashby said, her voice strained, "this tragedy has us all on edge. Poor Clara is beside herself, trying to keep the ambassador's work alive. She's been sorting his papers all morning." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "A devoted soul, indeed. Tell me, does the manor keep spare inkwells for guests? I noticed Miss Henshaw's cuff had a smudge, and I wondered if she'd been writing in a hurry." Lady Ashby frowned, her brow furrowing. "Inkwells? Oh, yes. Each room has a writing desk, fully stocked, but the ink is standard black, nothing unusual. Why do you ask?" "Oh, just a passing thought," Miss Marple said airily, her smile disarming. But her mind was far from idle. The smudge on Clara's cuff had a faint bluish tint, not the deep black of standard ink. Perhaps a private supply, she thought, or something else entirely. She resolved to examine the ambassador's suite again, if Inspector Crane would permit it. That afternoon, with the inspector's reluctant approval, Miss Marple stood once more in the ambassador's suite. The room was as it had been, save for the absence of Renault's body, now removed to the morgue. The silk scarf, still lying on a side table under police guard, drew her eye. Its pattern, intricate and exotic, was unlike anything in St. Mary Mead's modest shops. She bent closer, noting a faint stain near one end. Not blood, but something oily, perhaps cosmetic. A woman's touch, she wondered, thinking of Clara's meticulous appearance and the smudge on her cuff. The desk, too, held her attention. Renault's papers were neatly stacked, as Clara had described, but one sheet was slightly askew, its corner curled as if lifted and replaced in haste. Miss Marple, careful not to touch, noted the absence of an inkwell on the desk. Strange, she thought, for a man who wrote as much as an ambassador. She recalled Clara's notebook, its worn edges suggesting constant use. Had she been in this room, despite her claims? And if so, why? As she left the suite, Miss Marple passed Clara in the corridor, the aide's arms laden with files. Their eyes met briefly, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps, or defiance. "Miss Henshaw," she said kindly, "you must be exhausted. Do take care." Clara nodded curtly and hurried on, her footsteps echoing in the silent hall. Back in the drawing room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind weaving a different kind of pattern. Clara's alibi was shaky, her agitation evident, her devotion a potential mask for deeper motives. The smudge, the crease, the notebook, all were threads in a tapestry yet to be completed. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead, shopgirl, who had once hidden a theft behind tears of loyalty to her employer. People, Miss Marple mused, are never quite what they seem, especially when they love too fiercely. The summit's tension grew, the delegates' voices sharper now, their smiles thinner. Miss Marple knew. The truth lay not in grand gestures, but in the small, overlooked details. A crease, a smudge, a lie told with trembling hands. As the day waned, she settled deeper into her armchair, her needles clicking, her mind as sharp as ever, ready to unravel the next thread in the mystery of the strangled ambassador. Chapter 3. The Translator's Tongue. The soft glow of morning light filtered through the heavy drapes of Lord Ashby's manor, casting a golden sheen across the library, where Inspector Crane had resumed his interrogations. The room, with its towering shelves and faint scent of aged leather, seemed an unlikely stage for unraveling a murder. Yet it was here that Miss Jane Marple found herself, seated unobtrusively near a window, her knitting a quiet rhythm against the tension in the air. Her presence, as ever, was a blend of the innocuous and the incisive, her pale blue eyes missing nothing as they followed the next suspect, Dmitri Volkov, the summit's translator. Dmitri entered with a measured stride, his wiry frame clad in a charcoal suit that seemed almost too large for him, as if borrowed from a grander man. His dark hair was slicked back, and his sharp eyes darted briefly to Miss Marple before settling on Inspector Crane, who stood by the library's oak table, his notebook open and his expression stern. Dmitri's hands, long-fingered and restless, adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture. Miss Marple noted, though his face betrayed no such unease. "Mr. Volkov," Inspector Crane began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "As translator, you had access to every conversation at this summit. You were privy to the ambassador's words, his confidences. Where were you last night between 9 and 10:15? Dmitri's lips curved into a faint, almost sardonic smile. "In this very room, Inspector," he replied, his voice smooth with a trace of an accent, polished yet elusive. "I was reviewing documents, transcripts of the day's discussions. The ambassador's words were complex. They required my full attention." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her gaze resting on Dmitri's cufflinks, which gleamed under the library's chandelier. They were silver, engraved with a crest she did not recognize. A stylized eagle, perhaps, or a symbol from a distant nation. Curious, she thought, for a man who claims no allegiance beyond his work. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Taylor, who had once worn a foreign medal, hinting at a past he never spoke of. Such adornments, she knew, were rarely mere decoration. Inspector Crane's pen scratched across his notebook. "Alone, then? No one saw you here?" Dmitri's smile tightened, his fingers tapping lightly on the table's edge. "The library was quiet. I prefer solitude when I work. The maids can confirm I was here earlier. They brought me coffee at 8. His tone was confident, but Miss Marple noted a slight pause before he spoke, as if choosing his words with care. She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle as a village gossip's. "Mr. Volkov, your role must be quite demanding. translating not just words but intentions. Did Ambassador Renaud ever seem troubled? Perhaps he shared something that weighed on him? Dimitri's eyes narrowed, though his expression remained polite. The ambassador was a man of conviction, he said carefully. He spoke of peace, but peace is a thorny path. He had his burdens, as all great men do, but he kept them close. I merely translated his words, not his heart. Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene, but her mind was alight. Dimitri's fluency was his shield, his words as carefully crafted as a diplomat's. Yet she recalled the previous evening, when she had passed the library on her way to her room. The windows had been dark, no flicker of lamplight within. A man working late, she mused, would need light to read by. The discrepancy nagged at her, a loose thread in the fabric of his alibi. Inspector Crane pressed on, his questions sharp and unyielding. You had access to the ambassador's suite, did you not? You delivered documents to him, perhaps even last night? Dimitri's fingers stilled, his posture stiffening. I brought him papers earlier in the day, he admitted. Routine matters, summit agendas, translations of proposals. But I did not enter his suite after dinner. My work was done here. He gestured to the library, his hand sweeping toward a stack of papers on the table, neatly arranged but untouched by dust, as if placed there deliberately. Miss Marple's gaze followed his gesture, noting the paper's pristine edges. Freshly arranged, she thought, not the work of a man absorbed in study. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead clerk, who had staged his desk to feign diligence, only to be caught napping in the churchyard. Appearances, she knew, were often the first lie told. As the interrogation continued, Miss Marple rose quietly, her knitting tucked under her arm, and approached the library's windows. She peered out at the gravel path below, where the gardener, Tom, was raking leaves with a distracted air. Tom, she called softly, beckoning him closer. You were about last night, weren't you? Did you see anyone near the library, perhaps? Tom scratched his head, his cap tilting. Not in the library, Miss Marple, but I saw that translator fellow, Mr. Volkoff, by the west gate near 9:30. He was talking to someone, low-like, but I couldn't hear. Looked right secretive, he did. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind turning over this new detail. Dimitri had claimed to be in the library, yet Tom placed him outside, near the west wing, close to the ambassador's suite. A conversation in the shadows, she thought, is rarely innocent. She returned to her seat, her needles resuming their rhythm, as Inspector Crane concluded his questions. Very well, Mr. Volkoff, the inspector said, his tone skeptical. We'll verify your account. You're free to go, but stay within the manor. Dimitri inclined his head, his smile returning, though it did not reach his eyes. As he left, Miss Marple noted the faint scuff on his shoe, a smear of earth that matched the damp soil of the manor's paths. Not the mark of a man indoors all evening, she thought, her mind weaving connections. Later, Miss Marple sought out the maid who had brought Dimitri's coffee. The girl, a nervous creature named Lily, fidgeted under Miss Marple's gentle questioning. Yes, miss, I brought him coffee at 8, like he said, but he wasn't in the library when I came back to collect the tray, not past 9. The cup was cold, untouched. Miss Marple patted Lily's hand, her smile reassuring. You've been most helpful, my dear. The cold coffee, the dark library, the scuffed shoe, all pointed to a man whose story did not hold. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead postman who had lied about his rounds, his excuses unraveling when a neighbor noted his bicycle's muddy tires. "The truth," she murmured, "is in the things left undone." That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the library, with Inspector Crane's permission, to examine the scene of Dimitri's supposed work. The papers on the table were indeed summit documents, but their order was too perfect, their pages uncreased. She lifted one carefully, noting a faint watermark, a crest matching Dimitri's cufflinks. A connection, she thought, but to what? The crest suggested a tie to one of the summit's nations, or perhaps something older, more personal. She made a mental note to inquire about Dimitri's background, perhaps through Lady Ashby's diplomatic contacts. As she left the library, Miss Marple passed Dimitri in the corridor, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. There was a wariness in his gaze, a flicker of calculation that belied his smooth demeanor. "Good day, Miss Marple," he said, his voice polite but cool. She nodded, her smile as bland as ever, but her mind was far from idle. A man who speaks many tongues, she thought, may also speak many lies. Back in the drawing room, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting a steady counterpoint to the summit's growing unease. The delegates whispered of espionage, of motives tied to the summit's fragile peace. Dimitri's role placed him at the heart of those secrets, his fluency a key to locked doors. Yet his alibi was fraying, his cufflinks and scuffed shoes hinting at a hidden purpose. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead, schoolmaster, who had used his knowledge to conceal a theft, his cleverness undone by a single misplaced book. Knowledge, Miss Marple mused, is a weapon, but it leaves traces. The manor's clock chimed, marking the slow march of the investigation. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts weaving a pattern from the threads of Dimitri's story. The translator's tongue was sharp, but its edges were beginning to show. As the summit's tension mounted, she knew the truth would emerge not in grand revelations, but in the quiet details, a crest, a scuff, a lie told with too much care. Chapter 4. The Diplomat's Ambition. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, its rays piercing the tall windows of Lord Ashby's manor and casting long, wavering shadows across the polished floors. The air within the manor was thick with the strain of the ongoing summit, now overshadowed by the brutal murder of Ambassador Victor Renaud. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner of the drawing room, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm, observed the comings and goings of the delegates with a quiet intensity. Her delicate hands, though busy with wool, were guided by a mind as sharp as a blade, slicing through the veneer of decorum to the secrets beneath. Inspector Crane, ever methodical, had summoned the next suspect to the library for questioning. Sir Harold Bryce, a diplomat whose polished exterior and easy charm had made him a prominent figure at the summit. Miss Marple, permitted to attend as a silent observer at Lady Ashby's insistence, followed at a discreet distance, her sensible shoes whispering against the oak floorboards. The library, with its scent of old books and wax, felt like a courtroom, its shelves bearing witness to the unfolding drama. Sir Harold entered with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, his tailored suit immaculate, his graying hair swept back with aristocratic precision. His smile, broad and practiced, seemed to fill the room, yet Miss Marple noted a faint tightness at its edges, as if it were a mask donned for the occasion. He took a seat opposite Inspector Crane, crossing one leg over the other with deliberate ease, his hands resting lightly on the arms of the chair. "Sir Harold," Inspector Crane began, his tone clipped but respectful. "You and Ambassador Renaud were known to disagree, particularly on trade policies. Some might call it a rivalry. Where were you last night between 9 and 10:15? Sir Harold's smile did not waver, though his eyes flicked briefly to Miss Marple before returning to the inspector. "In the garden, Inspector," he replied smoothly. "I needed a moment's respite after dinner. The summit's discussions are taxing, as you might imagine. I smoked a cigar by the rose arbor, alone, enjoying the quiet." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second, her gaze settling on Sir Harold's hands. They were well manicured, but a faint smudge of ink marred the edge of his right index finger, a detail at odds with his claim of an idle evening. A man smoking in a garden, she thought, would not have ink on his fingers unless he had been writing, or handling something written. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead's solicitor, who had once betrayed his late-night correspondence with a similar smudge, a clue to his clandestine affairs. Inspector Crane's pen scratched across his notebook. "Alone, you say? No one saw you? The garden is large, but the manor's staff are everywhere." Sir Harold's smile widened, a touch too bright. "I'm afraid I'm not one for company when I take my air. The staff were busy indoors, and the other guests were occupied. I saw no one, and no one saw me." His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted a slight emphasis on "no one," as if he were daring contradiction. She leaned forward, her voice soft and unassuming. "Sir Harold, you must find these summits quite a chess game, with so much at stake. Did Ambassador Renaud ever seem apprehensive? Perhaps about a rival's ambitions?" Sir Harold's eyes met hers, and for a moment a shadow passed across his face, swiftly replaced by his practiced charm. "Renaud was a formidable player," he said, his tone measured. "He had his worries, as we all do, but he kept them to himself. My disagreements with him were professional, nothing more. Ambition is no crime, Miss Marple." Miss Marple nodded, her smile as gentle as ever, but her mind was racing. Ambition, she knew, could be a fire that consumed all restraint. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Alderman, whose hunger for power had led to a scandal over forged documents, his downfall marked by a single misplaced letter. Sir Harold's ink-stained finger, his too perfect alibi, suggested a man with more on his mind than a cigar in the moonlight. Inspector Crane pressed further, his questions methodical. "You had access to the ambassador's suite, did you not? As a diplomat, you could move freely through the manor." Sir Harold's posture stiffened, though his smile held. "Access, yes, but no reason to use it. I had no business with Renaud after dinner. My focus was on the summit's next steps, not on personal matters." His fingers brushed the arm of the chair, and Miss Marple noted a faint tremor, quickly suppressed. As the interrogation drew to a close, Sir Harold rose, adjusting his cufflinks with a flourish. "If there's nothing else, Inspector, I have delegates to reassure. This tragedy must not derail our work." His tone was brisk, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance toward the library's desk, where a stack of summit papers lay under the inspector's watchful eye. After he departed, Miss Marple took a turn about the manor's grounds, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders. The rose arbor, where Sir Harold claimed to have smoked, was a secluded spot, its benches surrounded by thorny blooms. She knelt, her eyes scanning the gravel path. No cigar ash, no stub, only the faint imprint of a man's shoe, its size matching Sir Harold's polished brogues. A man who smokes leaves traces, she thought, but a man who lies leaves gaps. She recalled Tom, the gardener, and sought him out near the stables. "Tom," she said brightly, "you were about last night, weren't you? Did you see Sir Harold in the garden, perhaps by the arbor?" Tom frowned, rubbing his chin. "Not by the arbor, Miss Marple. Saw him near the west wing, though, round 9:30. He was pacing, looked right agitated. No cigar, mind, just walking quick-like, toward the manor." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind alight with this discrepancy. Sir Harold's alibi placed him in the garden, yet Tom saw him near the west wing, close to Renault's suite, at a critical time. Pacing, she mused, is the habit of a man with a purpose or a problem. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead merchant, who had paced the village square before confessing to a swindle, his agitation a prelude to truth. Returning to the manor, Miss Marple sought permission to revisit the ambassador's suite, accompanied by a young constable who watched her with bemused respect. The room was as she remembered, the desk orderly, the scarf still on the side table, its oily stain catching the light. She examined the desk more closely, noting a faint scratch on its surface, as if a pen had been dragged in haste. Ink, she thought, and a hurried hand. She recalled Sir Harold's smudged finger, the absence of cigar ash, and the shoe print that told a different story. Later, in the drawing-room, Miss Marple overheard a snatch of conversation between two delegates. "Bryce stands to gain," one whispered. "With Renault gone, his proposals will carry the day." Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts weaving a pattern. Sir Harold's ambition was no secret, but ambition, she knew, could drive a man to desperate acts. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead, doctor, who had sabotaged a rival's practice, his charm masking a ruthless streak. "Power," she murmured, "is a motive as old as time." That evening, Miss Marple dined with Lady Ashby, who was visibly strained by the summit's turmoil. "Sir Harold is pushing forward," Lady Ashby said, her voice low. "He's already drafting new proposals, as if Renault's death were a mere inconvenience. It's unseemly, Jane." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "He's a driven man, I gather. Tell me, are the manor's desks all stocked with the same ink? I noticed a smudge on Sir Harold's finger, and I wondered." Lady Ashby frowned. "The desks have black ink, standard for all guests, but Sir Harold brought his own pen, I believe, a fountain pen, quite distinctive. He's particular about such things." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. A fountain pen could explain the ink, but not its presence after an evening supposedly spent smoking. A man with his own pen, she thought, writes his own story, perhaps literally. She resolved to examine the summit papers in the library, where Sir Harold had been seen delivering documents earlier in the day. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting a quiet companion. Sir Harold's charm, his ink-stained finger, his false alibi, all pointed to a man with secrets. The shoe print, the pacing, the absence of cigar ash formed a constellation of clues, each small but significant. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead vicar, who had hidden his gambling debts behind a genial facade, undone by a single misplaced betting slip. Ambition, Miss Marple mused, builds castles, but it also digs graves. The summit's tension coiled tighter, the delegates' voices edged with suspicion. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind threading together the fragments of Sir Harold's story. The Diplomats' ambition was a beacon, but its light cast shadows, she was determined to explore. Chapter 5. The Protesters' Passion. The late afternoon light draped St. Mary Mead in a golden hush, softening the edges of Lord Ashby's manor, where the summit's somber proceedings continued under the weight of Ambassador Victor Renault's murder. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in the drawing-room with her knitting, watched the world beyond the manor's windows with a gaze as gentle as it was piercing. The protesters outside, a small but fervent knot, waved placards and chanted slogans against the summit's aims, their voices a distant hum that carried an undercurrent of unrest. Among them, one figure stood out, a young woman with fiery eyes and a defiant posture. Eliza Kane, the final suspect in Inspector Crane's methodical inquiry. Miss Marple, invited once more to observe the interrogation in the library, followed the inspector with her characteristic, unhurried step, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders. The library's heavy air, scented with old books and wax, seemed to press down as Eliza entered, her boots scuffing the polished floor. She was a striking contrast to the manor's refined occupants. Her dark hair was pulled back in a careless braid, her jacket patched at the elbows, and her eyes blazed with a passion that seemed to challenge the room itself. She stood rather than sat, her hands clenched at her sides, as if ready to spring. "Miss Kane," Inspector Crane began, his voice steady but edged with skepticism. "You were arrested yesterday afternoon for disturbing the peace outside the manor, released at 7, yet you were seen near the grounds later that evening. Where were you between 9 and 10:15? Eliza's chin lifted, her gaze defiant. "I was back in the village by then, Inspector," she said, her voice sharp with conviction. "I came to the manor earlier, yes, to make a point. Leaflets, slogans, nothing more. This summit's a farce, and Renault was no saint, but I didn't kill him. I was gone before any scream." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes resting on a crumpled leaflet that Eliza had dropped during her earlier arrest, now lying on the library table under the inspector's scrutiny. The paper bore bold, inked words condemning the summit, but what caught Miss Marple's attention was a faint trace of silk thread caught in its folded edge, shimmering faintly in the lamplight. A thread, she thought. From a scarf, perhaps? She recalled a saint. Mary Mead girl, who had once hidden stolen goods in a bundle of laundry, her guilt betrayed by a single stray fiber. Inspector Crane leaned forward, his pen poised. "You admit to sneaking into the manor grounds, then, to make a point. That's a thin line from trespassing to something worse. Did you enter the manor itself?" Eliza's eyes flashed, but her voice remained steady. "I slipped past the gate. Yes, to leave leaflets in the courtyard. I didn't go inside. I'm not fool enough to tangle with diplomats in their own lair." Her fingers twitched, as if itching to gesture, but she kept them clenched. Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice as mild as a summer breeze. "Miss Kane, your passion for your cause is quite evident. Did you ever meet Ambassador Renault? Perhaps he said something to provoke such fervor?" Eliza's expression hardened, though a flicker of unease crossed her face. "I never spoke to him," she said curtly. "He was the summit's face, its lies. My fights with the system, not one man. I wanted to disrupt their plans, not end a life." Her words were fierce, but Miss Marple noted a slight tremor in her voice, a crack in her defiance. The interrogation continued, with Crane probing Eliza's movements and motives. She admitted to her group's opposition to the summit, claiming it served powerful interests at the expense of the common good. Yet her alibi, being in the village by 9, was vague, unsupported by witnesses. Miss Marple's mind turned to the silk thread, its delicate weave matching the murder weapon's exotic pattern. Passion, she mused, can blind, but it can also bind, tight as a scarf. As Eliza was dismissed, her parting glance at Miss Marple held a mix of defiance and wariness. Miss Marple watched her go, noting the scuff of mud on Eliza's boots, fresh and damp, suggesting a recent trek through the manor's grounds. Not the mark of a woman long gone to the village, she thought, recalling a St. Mary Mead poacher whose muddy boots had betrayed his nighttime wanderings. Seeking further clarity, Miss Marple took a turn about the manor's courtyard, where Eliza had claimed to leave her leaflets. The cobblestones were littered with a few discarded papers, their ink smudged by dew. She knelt, careful not to disturb the scene, and examined one closely. The same silk thread clung to its edge, its sheen unmistakable. Nearby, a low hedge bore a faint tear, as if someone had brushed past in haste. A hurried exit, she thought, or an entry. She recalled Tom, the gardener, and sought him out by the gate. "Tom," she said brightly, "you saw quite a bit last night, didn't you? Did you notice that young woman, Miss Kane, near the courtyard or the west wing?" Tom nodded, his cap bobbing. "Aye, Miss Marple. Saw her by the west gate, round 9:15. She was slipping through quick-like with a bundle of papers. Looked like she was up to no good, but I didn't stop her. Too busy with the roses." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind weaving this new thread into the pattern. Eliza's claim of leaving for the village was undermined by Tom's sighting, placing her near the west wing, close to Renault's suite, moments before the critical time. A protester's zeal, she thought, can turn to desperation in the dark. Returning to the manor, Miss Marple sought out the constable guarding the ambassador's suite. With his permission, she examined the scarf once more, its oily stain catching her eye. She leaned closer, noting its faint floral scent, not unlike a cosmetic balm. A woman's touch, perhaps, she mused, thinking of Eliza's patched jacket and careless braid. Had she carried such a balm, perhaps in a tin tucked in her pocket? Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead baker's daughter, whose scented lotion had left a trail to a stolen recipe, her passion for her craft masking her deceit. At dinner, Miss Marple overheard whispers among the delegates, some speculating that Eliza's group sought to sabotage the summit entirely. Lady Ashby, seated beside her, confided in a low voice, "That Kane girl's been to markets abroad, Jane. Her group travels, stirring trouble wherever they go. I wouldn't put it past her to have brought that scarf from some foreign bazaar." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind was alight. The scarf's exotic pattern, the thread on the leaflet, the mud on Eliza's boots, all pointed to a woman whose passion had brought her closer to the crime than she admitted. Yet passion, Miss Marple knew, could be a spark that ignited more than words. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead suffragette who had burned a barn in her fervor, her regret coming too late. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting a steady companion. Eliza's defiance, her muddy boots, her leaflet's telltale thread formed a constellation of clues, each small but sharp. The summit's air grew heavier, the delegates' voices tinged with fear of further disruption. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts threading through the protesters' story. Passion was a powerful motive, but it left traces, traces she would follow to the truth. Chapter 6. The Scarf's Secret. The evening shadows lengthened across the manicured lawns of Lord Ashby's manor, cloaking St. Mary Mead in a somber twilight that seemed to mirror the unease within. The summit, though pressing forward, was a fragile thing, its delegates moving through the grand halls with guarded glances and hushed voices. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting, let her needles dance with their familiar rhythm, her eyes drifting to the window where the last light glinted off the distant village spire. The murder of Ambassador Victor Renaud hung over the manor like a storm cloud, and Miss Marple's mind, ever nimble, turned to the one clue that bound all suspects, the silk scarf used to strangle him. The scarf, now held under lock and key by Inspector Crane, was no ordinary object. Its intricate pattern, woven with threads of gold and crimson, spoke of distant markets and foreign hands, a far cry from the homespun goods of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, granted permission to examine it once more under the watchful eye of a young constable, made her way to the manor's study, where the scarf lay on a table, its silken folds catching the lamplight. She leaned closer, her spectacles glinting, and noted again the faint, oily stain near one end, its floral scent lingering like a whispered secret. "Not blood," she murmured, "but something personal, perhaps a balm or a mark of carelessness." Inspector Crane, standing nearby with his notebook, watched her with a mix of curiosity and impatience. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped, "the scarf's origin is a puzzle, I grant you. No monogram, no label. It could belong to anyone, or no one, here. But it's our only physical link to the killer. Have you any thoughts?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost apologetic. "Only that it's a curious thing, Inspector. A scarf like this isn't bought in a village shop. It speaks of travel, of intention. Whoever brought it to the manor had a purpose, don't you think?" Her tone was mild, but her mind was alight, threading together the scarf's presence with the suspects' lives. She recalled Clara Henshaw's creased blouse and inky cuff, Dmitri Volkov's engraved cufflinks and scuffed shoes, Sir Harold Bryce's ink-stained finger and false alibi, and Eliza Kane's muddy boots and leaflet-bound thread. Each had access to Renaud's suite, each a motive tied to the summit stakes. But the scarf, with its exotic weave, seemed to point beyond the manor's walls. Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead traveler who had once brought back a shawl from a far-off market, its beauty hiding a tale of betrayal. Objects, she mused, carry stories if one knows how to read them. Leaving the study, Miss Marple took a turn through the manor's gallery, where portraits of Ashby ancestors gazed down with stern approval. She paused by a window overlooking the courtyard, where the summit's guests had arrived days ago, their luggage piled high and unchecked in the bustle. A scarf like that, she thought, could slip through in a diplomatic bag, unnoticed. She resolved to inquire about the guests' travels, particularly those of the suspects, whose paths might have crossed foreign bazaars. At dinner, Miss Marple sat beside Lady Ashby, whose strained smile betrayed the burden of hosting a summit now tainted by murder. "Jane," Lady Ashby said quietly, "this scarf business unsettles me. It's so out of place. I've seen similar patterns in markets abroad, Constantinople, perhaps, or Marrakesh, but none of our staff would own such a thing." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest. "Indeed, my dear. Have any of the summit's guests traveled to such places recently?" Miss Henshaw, perhaps, or Mr. Volkoff. Lady Ashby frowned, her fork pausing mid-air. Clara accompanied Renaud to several capitals last year, Vienna, Istanbul, among others. Dmitri, too, has traveled widely. His work takes him wherever words are needed. Sir Harold keeps to Europe, mostly, but Eliza Kane's group is known for its wanderings. They've protested in half a dozen countries, from what I hear. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. Istanbul, a city of markets, where silk scarves were as common as secrets. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead widow, who had bought a trinket abroad, only to find it tied to a smuggler's scheme. Travel, she thought, broadens the mind, but it also opens doors to mischief. Later, Miss Marple sought out the manor's porter, a grizzled man named Mr. Gibbs, who had overseen the arrival of the summit's guests. She found him polishing brass in the entrance hall, his hands steady despite his years. "Mr. Gibbs," she said brightly, "you must have seen all sorts come through these doors. Did any of the guests, Miss Henshaw perhaps, or Miss Kane, arrive with unusual luggage? Something that might hold a scarf, say?" Gibbs scratched his chin, his eyes narrowing. "Can't say I looked close, Miss Marple, but Miss Kane had a rucksack, patched and worn, like she'd been traipsing the world. Miss Henshaw had a proper case, mind, but it was heavy. Papers, she said. Mr. Volkoff carried a leather satchel, fancy-like, and Sir Harold had his valet handle his bags. Nothing stood out, but we didn't search 'em. Diplomatic privilege, you see." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind turning over the possibilities. A rucksack, a satchel, a case. Any could conceal a scarf, slipped in among clothes or documents. She thought of Eliza's leaflet, its silk thread a silent witness, and of Clara's notebook, its worn edges hinting at constant use. Dimitri's satchel, with its foreign crest, and Sir Harold's valet, who might overlook a small item, added to the puzzle. A scarf, she mused, is a small thing, but a deadly one. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple overheard a snippet of conversation between two delegates, their voices low with suspicion. "That scarf's no coincidence," one said. "Someone brought it to make a point, exotic, like a message." The other nodded, glancing toward the west wing, where Renaud's suite lay silent. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts weaving a pattern. The scarf's origin was a clue, but its presence in the manor was a choice. Who had chosen it, and why? Seeking further insight, Miss Marple approached the constable guarding the suite, requesting another look at the scarf. He obliged, standing stiffly as she examined it under the study's lamp. The oily stain, she noted, was not uniform. It pooled at one end, as if pressed there by a finger or a fold. The floral scent was stronger now, distinct from the manor's soaps or perfumes. A cosmetic, she thought, or perhaps a salve, carried by someone careless or hurried. She recalled Eliza's patched jacket, which might hold a tin of balm, and Clara's meticulous hands, which might conceal a private habit. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting a steady counterpoint to the manor's growing tension. The scarf was a bridge between the suspects, its exotic weave tying them to distant places and hidden motives. Clara's travels, Dimitri's crest, Sir Harold's ambition, Eliza's zeal, all swirled around this single silken clue. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead seamstress, who had once hidden a stolen gem in a shawl's hem, her crime undone by a single loose stitch. "Secrets," Miss Marple murmured, "are sewn into the smallest things." The summit's delegates grew restless, their whispers of sabotage and betrayal echoing through the halls. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind threading through the scarf's story. Its secret was not just in its origin, but in the hands that had wielded it, a choice that would lead her closer to the truth. Chapter 7. Whispers in the Hall. The twilight that settled over St. Mary Mead carried a chill that seemed to seep into the very walls of Lord Ashby's manor, where the summit's delegates moved like shadows, their voices low and laden with unease. Miss Jane Marple, ever a fixture in the drawing-room with her knitting, sat near the hearth, the fire's glow casting a soft light on her delicate features. Her needles moved with their familiar cadence, a quiet counterpoint to the murmur of suspicion that now permeated the air. The murder of Ambassador Victor Renaud had fractured the summit's fragile harmony, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming presence, was attuned to the whispers that drifted through the manor's corridors, each one a potential thread in the tapestry of truth. The day had been one of restless activity, with Inspector Crane's interrogations yielding more questions than answers. Miss Marple, permitted to linger as an observer, had taken to wandering the manor's halls, her steps soft but purposeful, her ears attuned to the fragments of conversation that slipped through half-open doors. The delegates, though bound by protocol, could not resist the human urge to speculate, and their words, like leaves scattered by an autumn wind, held clues for those who knew how to gather them. As she passed the grand staircase, Miss Marple overheard Clara Henshaw, the ambassador's aide, speaking to a junior diplomat in a hushed tone. Renaud's demands were unreasonable, Clara said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. He pushed too hard, always expecting perfection. It wore on us all. The diplomat nodded sympathetically, but Miss Marple noted the tremor in Clara's hands, clutching her worn notebook as if it were a lifeline. Demands, she thought, can breed resentment even in the loyal. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead, housekeeper, who had turned on her exacting employer, her devotion curdling into quiet rebellion. Further along the corridor, near the library, Miss Marple caught a snippet of Dmitri Volkov's voice, low and bitter. "Betrayals," he muttered to an unseen listener, perhaps himself. "They're woven into every summit." Renaud knew that better than most. His words were clipped, his accent sharper in anger. Miss Marple paused, her knitting tucked under her arm, and noted the library door ajar, no light within. A man who speaks of betrayal, she mused, may have felt its sting, or dealt it. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead, shopkeeper, who had whispered of treachery, only to be found guilty of selling secrets himself. In the dining hall where preparations for the evening's meal were underway, Miss Marple overheard Sir Harold Bryce, his voice carrying a note of triumph as he spoke to a fellow diplomat. "A new order is possible now," he said, his smile audible even from a distance. "Renaud's absence clears the way for progress." The words were bold, almost callous, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning to a St. Mary Mead counselor, whose ambition had led him to sabotage a rival's campaign, his geniality a mask for ruthlessness. Progress, she thought, is a fine word for those who stand to gain. The most telling whisper came from the courtyard, where Miss Marple, taking a turn in the cool evening air, glimpsed Eliza Kane's leaflets scattered near the gate. One, caught in a hedge, bore a scrawled note in the margin. "The summit hides their lies." The words, inked in haste, suggested a conspiracy, a motive rooted in disruption. Miss Marple bent to retrieve the leaflet, noting again the faint silk thread clinging to its edge, a match for the scarf's exotic weave. "A cause," she murmured, "can drive one to extremes, especially when it feels betrayed." She recalled a saint, Mary Mead activist whose fervor had led to vandalism, her passion blinding her to consequence. Returning to the manor, Miss Marple sought out Lady Ashby, who was overseeing the placement of silverware with a distracted air. "My dear," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "these whispers among the guests, are they common at such gatherings? I heard Miss Henshaw speak of demands, and Mr. Volkoff of betrayals. It's all rather illuminating." Lady Ashby sighed, her eyes weary. "Summits are breeding grounds for discontent, Jane. Clara was devoted, but Renaud was a hard taskmaster. Dimitri's work exposes him to every grudge and scheme. Sir Harold sees opportunity in chaos, and Eliza's group thrives on discord. These whispers are their truths, spoken carelessly." Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene, but her mind alight. The whispers were not mere gossip. They were windows into motive, each suspect revealing a piece of their heart. Clara's resentment, Dimitri's bitterness, Sir Harold's opportunism, Eliza's zeal. All were threads, but the scarf remained the knot that bound them. She resolved to revisit the ambassador's suite, hoping to find a clue that might tie these whispers to the crime. With Inspector Crane's permission, Miss Marple entered the suite, now dim and silent under the constable's watchful eye. The scarf, still on the side table, drew her like a magnet. She examined it closely, noting the oily stains, floral scent, which seemed stronger in the evening air. A balm, she thought, or perhaps a lotion, carried by someone unaware of its trace. She turned to the desk, where Renaud's papers remained, one sheet still askew. Bending closer, she saw a faint impression in the blotter. A word, perhaps, pressed too hard by a hurried pen. "Trust," it read, barely legible. A curious word, she mused, for a man surrounded by whispers of betrayal. Leaving the suite, Miss Marple passed the West Wing corridor, where a maid, Lily, was dusting a banister with nervous haste. "Lily, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "you must hear all sorts of talk in these halls. Did you overhear anything last night, near the ambassador's room?" Lily hesitated, her cloth twisting in her hands. "Not much, miss, but I heard footsteps, quick ones, round 9:30. Couldn't say who, too dark to see. And a voice, low, like someone arguing, but I didn't catch the words." Miss Marple thanked her mind weaving this new detail into the pattern. Footsteps and an argument, near the time of the murder, suggested a confrontation. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead grocer, who had quarreled in whispers, his anger spilling into theft. Whispers, she thought, are loudest when they're meant to be secret. As night deepened, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting a steady companion. The manor's halls had yielded their secrets in fragments, Clara's strained loyalty, Dimitri's bitter hints, Sir Harold's bold ambition, Eliza's conspiratorial fervor. The scarf, with its oily stain and foreign weave, remained the enigma, its presence a deliberate choice. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead's scandal, where a whispered rumor had unraveled a theft, the truth hidden in careless words. "People speak," Miss Marple murmured, "when they think no one listens." The summit's tension coiled tighter, the delegates' whispers growing sharper, their trust fraying. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts threading through the murmurs of the hall. The truth, she knew, was not in the loudest voices, but in the quietest clues. A word on a blotter, a thread on a leaflet, a whisper in the dark. Chapter 8. The Night's Timeline. The night had drawn a velvet curtain over St. Mary Mead, the stars above Lord Ashby's manor twinkling with a clarity that belied the murky tangle of motives within its walls. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her modest room with its chintz curtains and polished oak furniture, let her knitting rest momentarily in her lap, her pale blue eyes gazing out at the darkened grounds. The murder of Ambassador Victor Renaud had cast a pall over the summit, and the air was thick with suspicion, each delegate a player in a game where the stakes were life and death. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the needles she wielded, turned to the precise sequence of events on the night of the crime, for she knew that truth often hid in the gaps between moments. Inspector Crane, ever the methodical investigator, had summoned Miss Marple to the library that morning, his brow furrowed with the weight of an incomplete puzzle. The room, with its towering shelves and faint scent of leather, was now a hub of inquiry, its long table strewn with notes and diagrams. Crane, pacing before a hastily drawn timeline, welcomed her with a nod, his respect for her insight grudging but genuine. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped, "we've pieced together what we can of last night's events, but the alibis are shaky. I'd value your thoughts on the sequence." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting tucked beside her, and studied the timeline scrawled on a sheet of paper. Renaud was last seen alive at 9 p.m., retiring to his suite after dinner. The scream that shattered the manor's calm came at 10:15 p.m., followed by the discovery of his body, strangled by the silk scarf. Between those hours, the suspects' accounts diverged. Clara Henshaw claimed to be in her room, organizing papers. Dmitri Volkov insisted he was in the library, reviewing transcripts. Sir Harold Bryce said he was smoking in the garden, and Eliza Kane swore she had left for the village. Yet each alibi, Miss Marple knew, was a thread that might unravel under scrutiny. "Inspector," she said, her voice as gentle as a village breeze, "timelines are like lace, beautifully ordered but full of holes. Have you spoken to the staff about sounds or movements in the West Wing? The manor's floors creak, and its walls are thin." Crane nodded, flipping a page in his notebook. "We've questioned the maids. One, Lily, heard a muffled thud near the ambassador's suite around 9:45 p.m. Not a scream, mind you, but something heavy, like a fall. No one else reported anything precise, but the footmen were busy downstairs, and the upper halls were quiet." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. "A thud," she mused, "suggests a struggle, or perhaps a stumble. Did Lily say where she was when she heard it?" "Near the west staircase," Crane replied, polishing the banister. "She couldn't see the suite's door from there, but the sound carried." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to a saint. Mary Mead Carpenter, who had once heard a crash in a neighbor's shed, revealing a hidden theft. Sounds, she thought, are often more honest than words. She recalled the suspect's movements. Clara seen pacing by the fountain, Dmitri near the west gate, Sir Harold by the west wing, and Eliza slipping through the courtyard. Each had been placed near the west wing, close to Renaud's suite, at times that overlapped with the critical hour. Seeking further clarity, Miss Marple requested a walk through the west wing, accompanied by the young constable, who had grown accustomed to her quiet persistence. The corridor, lined with portraits and lit by flickering sconces, was narrow, its floorboards prone to creaking underfoot. She paused by the ambassador's suite, noting its position. A corner room with a window overlooking the garden, its door visible from the staircase where Lily had been. A thud, she thought, would carry here, but a scream would echo louder. The absence of other sounds suggested a swift act, one that caught Renaud unaware. She examined the suite's door, its lock intact but easily picked, as the constable confirmed. "No sign of forced entry," he said, "but a hairpin or a slim tool could have done it." Miss Marple nodded, recalling a St. Mary Mead lockpicker whose skill had been undone by a squeaky hinge. "Opportunity," she murmured, "is a matter of access and timing." Returning to the library, Miss Marple reviewed Crane's timeline again, her fingers tracing the hours. Clara's claim of solitude in her room was contradicted by Tom's sighting at the fountain. Dimitri's library alibi was undermined by the dark windows and cold coffee. Sir Harold's garden stroll lacked cigar ash and placed him near the west wing. Eliza's village departure was belied by her presence at the gate. Each, she thought, was closer to the crime than they admit. To test her suspicions, Miss Marple sought out Lily, finding her in the servants' hall, her hands twisting a dust cloth. "Lily, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "that thud you heard, did it come before or after any footsteps? Think carefully now." Lily frowned, her eyes distant. "Before, miss, I think. I heard the thud, then footsteps, quick ones, moving away from the west wing. Couldn't say who, but they were light, not heavy like a man's boots." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind weaving this detail into the pattern. Light footsteps suggested Clara or Eliza, though Dimitri's wiry frame and Sir Harold's polished brogues could be deceptively soft. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead seamstress, whose quiet steps had hidden her midnight errands, her guilt revealed by a single dropped needle. Movement, Miss Marple mused, betrays intent. Later, at tea with Lady Ashby, Miss Marple probed gently about the manor's layout. "The West Wing," she said, "is rather isolated, isn't it? A perfect place for a private meeting, or a crime." Lady Ashby nodded, her teacup trembling slightly. "It's why Renaud chose that suite, quiet, away from the bustle. But the corridors echo, Jane. Someone must have heard more than a thud." Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts racing. The timeline was tightening. A thud at 9:45, footsteps retreating, a scream at 10:15. The gap suggested a delay. Perhaps Renaud lingered, wounded or unconscious before the final act. The scarf, with its oily stain and floral scent, hinted at a moment of intimacy or haste. She recalled Clara's inky cuff, Dimitri's scuffed shoes, Sir Harold's ink-stained finger, and Eliza's muddy boots, each a clue to their presence near the crime. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting a steady companion. The timeline was a map, its landmarks the suspect's lies and half-truths. A thud, footsteps, a scream. These were the beats of a deadly dance, and the scarf was its final flourish. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Baker, whose alibi had crumbled when his oven's clock proved him absent. "Time," Miss Marple murmured, "is the truest witness." The summit's tension pulsed through the manor, the delegates' voices sharp with fear of further disruption. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind threading through the night's timeline. The truth, she knew, lay in the moments between. Moments she would unravel with patience and precision. Chapter 9. The Motive's Mask. The soft glow of dawn crept over St. Mary Mead, bathing the rolling hills in a delicate light that did little to ease the oppressive atmosphere within Lord Ashby's manor. The summit, now a fragile web of diplomacy, strained by the murder of Ambassador Victor Renaud, pressed on with a grim determination, its delegates whispering of betrayal and sabotage. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the fire in the drawing-room, her knitting a gentle rhythm in her hands, let her thoughts drift like smoke, curling around the motives that lay beneath each suspect's carefully crafted facade. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively mild, saw through the masks people wore, for she knew that motives, like faces, were often hidden behind a veneer of propriety. The morning was quiet, the manor's halls hushed save for the occasional creak of a floorboard or the murmur of a servant. Miss Marple, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders, had spent the night piecing together the fragments of the case. Clara Henshaw's strained loyalty, Dmitri Volkov's bitter hints of betrayal, Sir Harold Bryce's unchecked ambition, and Eliza Kane's fervent zeal. Each suspect's story was a thread, but the scarf, the silken noose with its oily stain and floral scent, remained the knot that tied them to the crime. Yet it was motive, Miss Marple knew, that would unravel the truth, for people killed not for trifles, but for what they cherished most. She rose, her steps soft but purposeful, and made her way to the library, where Inspector Crane was reviewing his notes with a furrowed brow. He greeted her with a nod, his respect for her insight now tinged with a quiet reliance. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice weary, "we've alibis that don't hold, clues that point everywhere and nowhere. But motive, that's the crux. Clara was devoted, Dmitri had access, Sir Harold had rivalry, and Eliza had her cause. Yet none feels complete." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting resuming its steady cadence. "Motives, Inspector," she said softly, "are like shadows. They shift depending on the light. Each suspect cherishes something, duty, knowledge, power, or justice. But when that cherished thing is threatened, it can turn deadly." She thought of a saint, Mary Mead seamstress, who had killed to protect her lover's honor, her devotion masking a desperate act. Let us consider what each holds dear. Crane flipped open his notebook, his pen poised. Clara Henshaw, her loyalty to Renaud was absolute. She lived for his work, his vision. Could she have felt betrayed by him? Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning to Clara's creased blouse and trembling hands. "Loyalty," she said, "can sour when it's unreciprocated." I heard her speak of Renaud's unreasonable demands. Perhaps she gave her all, only to find it undervalued. In my village, a housekeeper once turned on her mistress for a similar slight, not with violence, but with theft. But theft and murder are not so far apart when resentment festers. Crane nodded, jotting a note. Dmitri Volkov, then. His role gave him access to secrets, every word, every deal. He spoke of betrayals. Could he have uncovered something Renaud hid? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. "Knowledge is a dangerous thing, Inspector. Dimitri's cufflinks, his scuffed shoes, his absence from the library. They suggest a man entangled in more than words. Perhaps he learned something that threatened his position, or his country's. I recall a St. Mary Mead clerk who sold secrets to protect his own interests, his bitterness a quiet poison. Dimitri's whispers of betrayal may point to his own." Crane's pen moved swiftly. "Sir Harold Bryce, his ambition is clear. Renault's death clears his path to influence, but would he risk murder for it? Ambition, Miss Marple said, is a fire that consumes restraint. Sir Harold's ink-stained finger, his pacing near the west wing, his talk of a new order, these are the marks of a man who sees opportunity in chaos. In St. Mary Mead, a councillor once sabotaged a rival's campaign, his charm hiding a ruthless streak. Sir Harold's smile is charming, but smiles can hide daggers. Crane's brow furrowed. And Eliza Kane, her passion for her cause is fierce. Her leaflets speak of conspiracies, and she was near the manor at the critical time. Could her zeal have turned violent? Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts weaving through Eliza's story. Passion, Inspector, is a spark that can ignite a blaze. Eliza's muddy boots, the silk thread on her leaflet, her presence at the gate. They suggest a woman driven to act. Her cause is her life, and Renault was its symbol. I recall a St. Mary Mead activist who burned a barn in her fervor, believing it served justice. Eliza's leaflets hint at a deeper grudge. Perhaps she saw Renault as more than a symbol, but a traitor to her ideals. Crane leaned back, his expression one of grudging admiration. You see motives where I see only shadows, Miss Marple. But how do we test them? The scarf ties them all, but motive points nowhere certain. Miss Marple smiled, her voice soft but firm. Motives are tested by their contradictions, Inspector. Each suspect claims innocence, but their actions betray them. Clara's resentment, Dimitri's secrets, Sir Harold's opportunity, Eliza's zeal, they all wear masks. We must look for the moment they slip. To test her theory, Miss Marple took a turn through the manor's west wing, her eyes scanning the corridors where whispers had been heard. She paused by the ambassador's suite, now sealed but still heavy with the memory of violence. The word trust on the blotter nagged at her, a clue to Renault's state of mind. A man who writes trust, she thought, may have feared its absence. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Vicar, who had scribbled a warning before his fall, his faith betrayed by a confidant. Seeking further insight, Miss Marple approached Lily, the maid, who was polishing silver in the servants' hall. "Lily, my dear," she said kindly, "you heard that thud near the west wing. Did you notice anything else? A scent, perhaps, or an object out of place?" Lily hesitated, her cloth twisting. "There was a smell, miss, faint-like, near the staircase. Floral, like a lady's perfume, but sharper. I thought it was the flowers in the hall, but they're roses, and this was different." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind alight with the floral scent of the scarf's oily stain. A balm, she thought, or a lotion carried by someone in haste. Clara's meticulous hands, Eliza's patched jacket, even Dimitri's satchel or Sir Harold's valet. Any could conceal such a thing. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Baker's daughter, whose scented lotion had betrayed her theft, its fragrance lingering where it shouldn't. At tea with Lady Ashby, Miss Marple probed gently. "The summit's stakes are high, aren't they? Renault's death could shift alliances, favor one cause over another. Do you know if any suspect stood to gain directly?" Lady Ashby's teacup trembled. "Sir Harold's proposals are gaining traction now, Jane. Clara's trying to preserve Renault's legacy, but she's struggling. Dimitri's translations are under scrutiny. Some say he skewed words to favor one side, and Eliza's group claims the summit hides corruption. They all have reasons to want change." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting a steady companion. The motives were clear, But their masks were clever. Clara's devotion hid resentment. Dimitri's knowledge veiled secrets. Sir Harold's ambition cloaked opportunism. Eliza's passion masked desperation. The scarf, with its floral stain, was the key. A personal item, chosen with intent. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead, widow, who had killed to protect her family's name, her motive hidden behind tears of loyalty. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, her needles clicking in the silence. The motives were a gallery of masks, each suspect hiding their truth behind a facade of duty, knowledge, power, or justice. The scarf, the thud, the floral scent, they were the cracks in those masks, and Miss Marple would peer through them. "People kill," she murmured, "for what they cherish, but their cherishing leaves traces." The summit's tension pulsed through the manor, the delegates' voices sharp with fear of collapse. Miss Marple's thoughts wove through the motives, seeking the one that fit the crime's precise shape. The truth, she knew, was behind the mask, and she was close to lifting it. Chapter 10. The Summit's Stakes. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, veiling Lord Ashby's manor in a gossamer shroud that seemed to mirror the uncertainty within its walls. The summit, now a precarious dance of diplomacy, shadowed by Ambassador Victor Renault's murder, pressed forward with a brittle resolve, its delegates navigating their roles with guarded words and wary glances. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing room with her knitting, let her needles move in their steady rhythm, her pale blue eyes drifting to the window where the mist swirled like secrets unspoken. Her mind, ever sharp, turned to the heart of the matter, the summit itself, its high stakes the crucible in which motives were forged. The murder had not merely claimed a life, it threatened to unravel the delicate threads of peace Renault had sought to weave between two feuding nations. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing the human heart beneath its posturing, knew that the summit's purpose held the key to the killer's intent. Renault's death could shift alliances, favor one faction, or derail negotiations entirely. A prize worth killing for, to the right mind. Her thoughts wove through the suspect's connections to this goal. Clara Henshaw's loyalty to Renault's vision, Dmitri Volkov's access to its secrets, Sir Harold Bryce's ambition to reshape it, and Eliza Kane's zeal to destroy it. Miss Marple rose, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders, and made her way to the manor's conservatory, a glass-walled haven where Lady Ashby often retreated to think. The air was heavy with the scent of hothouse flowers, their vibrant blooms a stark contrast to the manor's somber mood. Lady Ashby sat on a wicker chair, her hands clasped tightly, her face etched with strain. "Jane," she said, her voice low, "this summit is teetering. Renault was its anchor, and now chaos looms. The delegates are whispering of sabotage, of hidden agendas." Miss Marple settled beside her, her knitting a quiet companion. "My dear," she said gently, "a summit like this is a chessboard, isn't it? Each player with their own moves, their own stakes. Tell me, who stood to gain most if Renault's vision failed?" Lady Ashby's eyes flickered, her fingers tightening. "Sir Harold's proposals are bolder now, pushing for terms Renault opposed. Clara's trying to salvage Renault's work, but she's out of her depth. Dimitri's translations have stirred controversy. Some say he skewed words to favor one nation. And Eliza's group, Jane, they're not just protesters. They've ties to a faction that wants the summit to collapse, to prove the system corrupt." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind alight. The summit's stakes were a motive in themselves, each suspect tethered to its outcome. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead election where a candidate's sabotage had shifted power, his motive hidden in the chaos he sowed. A collapse, she mused, benefits those who thrive on disorder, or those who seek a new order. Seeking to deepen her understanding, Miss Marple requested access to the library, where summit documents were stored under Inspector Crane's watchful eye. He greeted her with a nod, his notebook open, his face weary. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've combed through Renault's papers, proposals, drafts, letters, but nothing explicit about enemies. Yet the summit's terms are contentious. Someone wanted him silenced." Miss Marple examined the papers, her fingers careful not to disturb their order. One document, a draft treaty, bore Renault's precise handwriting, its margins filled with notes on concessions neither nation favored. A man pushing for peace, she thought, steps on many toes. She noticed a faint crease in one page, as if it had been folded and unfolded in haste, perhaps by someone other than Renault. "Curious," she murmured, recalling Clara's notebook, Dimitri's satchel, or even Sir Harold's valet handling papers. Her attention returned to the scarf, still locked in the study but vivid in her memory. Its exotic weave, Lady Ashby had said, resembled those from Istanbul's markets, a place Clara had visited with Renault, where Eliza's group had protested and where Dimitri's travels might have led. Sir Harold, less traveled, was an outlier, but his ambition could have drawn him to such a symbol. The scarf's oily stain, with its floral scent, nagged at her. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead, traveler, whose foreign trinket had concealed a smuggler's intent, its beauty a distraction. To test her suspicions, Miss Marple sought out the manor's porter, Mr. Gibbs, who was stacking luggage in the entrance hall for departing delegates. "Mr. Gibbs," she said brightly, "you see all that comes and goes. Did any of the suspects, Miss Kane, perhaps, or Mr. Volkov, carry anything unusual from their travels? A scarf, maybe, or a parcel?" Gibbs rubbed his chin, his eyes narrowing. "Miss Kane's rucksack was stuffed, miss. Odds and ends from her protests abroad, I reckon. Mr. Volkov had that fancy satchel, always locked tight. Miss Henshaw's case was heavy with papers, and Sir Harold's valet brought trunks, but nothing stood out as a scarf. Mind, we didn't check closely. Diplomatic bags, you know." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind weaving this into the pattern. A rucksack, a satchel, a case. Any could hide a scarf, slipped in among belongings. Eliza's group, with its ties to a faction opposing the summit, seemed the likeliest source. Lady Ashby's words echoed. Eliza's protests had reached Istanbul, where such scarves were common. A symbol, Miss Marple thought, chosen to disrupt, perhaps to accuse. At luncheon, Miss Marple overheard a delegate mutter about Eliza's group, their leaflets branding Renault a pawn of corrupt powers. They wanted the summit to fail, the delegate said, to spark outrage. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts racing. Eliza's zeal, Clara's resentment, Dimitri's secrets, Sir Harold's opportunism. Each could be fueled by the summit's collapse, but Eliza's motive burned brightest. The scarf, with its foreign weave, felt like a statement, a protester's flourish. Seeking one last clue, Miss Marple revisited the West Wing, pausing by the staircase where Lily had heard the thud. The floral scent, Lily had said, was sharper than the hall's roses. Miss Marple bent near the banister, catching a faint whiff of something similar. Not perfume, but a balm, perhaps carried in a pocket or a bag. Eliza, she thought, with her patched jacket, or Clara, with her meticulous hands. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead girl, whose scented salve had betrayed her theft, its fragrance lingering on stolen goods. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting a steady companion. The summit's stakes were a crucible, forging motives from loyalty, knowledge, ambition, and zeal. The scarf, with its Istanbul weave and floral stain, pointed to Eliza, whose cause thrived on chaos. Yet Clara's travels, Dimitri's access, and Sir Harold's opportunism could not be dismissed. Miss Marple thought of a saint, Mary Mead merchant who had sabotaged a rival's wares to gain a market, his motive hidden in plain sight. "Stakes," she murmured, "are highest when the game is all." The manor pulsed with the summit's fragile hope, its delegates teetering on the edge of collapse. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind threading through the stakes and their shadows. The truth, she knew, was close. A single choice, a single act, hidden in the summit's heart. Chapter 11. The trap is set. The pale light of a late summer morning filtered through the heavy drapes of Lord Ashby's manor, casting a soft glow across the drawing room where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with their accustomed grace. The summit, now a brittle thread stretched taut by the murder of Ambassador Victor Renaud, hummed with a tension that seemed to vibrate in the very air. Miss Marple's delicate hands, though busy with wool, were guided by a mind that wove a tighter pattern, one of clues and contradictions that pointed ever closer to the truth. The scarf, the thud, the whispers, the motives, all were threads, and she was ready to pull them tight. The morning had brought a restless energy to the manor, with delegates whispering of collapse and Inspector Crane pacing the library, his notebook thick with notes but thin on certainty. Miss Marple, invited to join him for a discussion, entered the library with her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders, her presence as unassuming as ever. Crane greeted her with a nod, his eyes weary but sharp. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "we've alibis that crumble, clues that tangle, and motives aplenty. But we need a spark to light the truth. Have you a plan?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting a quiet counterpoint to the room's tension. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but firm, "the truth is like a nervous guest. It reveals itself when pressed. Each suspect has a story, but their stories falter under scrutiny. A test, perhaps, could shake loose the lie that hides the killer." She thought of a saint, Mary Mead grocer, who had confessed to theft when confronted with his own contradictions, his guilt betrayed by a trembling hand. Crane raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A test? You mean a trap, don't you? What do you propose?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. "Gather the suspects, Clara, Dimitri, Sir Harold, and Eliza, and ask them to recount their evenings again, but with a twist. Mention the scarf's stain, the floral scent, and watch their faces, their hands. The guilty will flinch, for they know more than they've said." She recalled a saint, Mary Mead seamstress, whose lie had unraveled when asked about a single misplaced pin, her panic revealing all. Crane agreed, though his skepticism lingered. He summoned the suspects to the drawing room that afternoon, the grand space now a stage for Miss Marple's subtle gambit. The four stood or sat, their postures a study in contrasts. Clara Henshaw, her notebook clutched tightly, her eyes darting. Dmitri Volkov, his wiry frame tense, his cufflinks glinting. Sir Harold Bryce, his smile polished but strained, and Eliza Kane, her defiance barely masking a nervous energy. The fire crackled, and Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting a steady rhythm, her gaze missing nothing. "Each of you," Crane began, his voice commanding, "has given an account of the night Ambassador Renaud died. But new evidence has come to light. The scarf used to strangle him bears a stain, oily with a floral scent. I want you to recount your evening again, every detail, and explain any contact you might have had with such an item. Miss Henshaw, you first." Clara's hands tightened on her notebook, her face paling. "I've told you, Inspector," she said, her voice steady but strained. "I was in my room, organizing papers. I never saw the scarf, and I don't use balms or lotions. My work leaves no time for such things." Her fingers fidgeted, brushing her cuff, where Miss Marple noted the faint ink smudge, now faded but still present. Dimitri spoke next, his voice smooth but his eyes wary. "I was in the library, as I said, reviewing transcripts. A scarf? I've no use for such things, and I carry no scented balms. My satchel holds only papers and pens." His fingers tapped the table, and Miss Marple saw a slight tremor, his cufflinks catching the light as if to distract. Sir Harold's smile was unwavering, though his eyes flicked to the others. "The garden, Inspector, as I've said. A cigar, the night air, nothing more. I don't carry scarves or cosmetics. My valet handles my belongings, and he'd know nothing of this." His hand rested casually on his knee, but Miss Marple noted the ink-stained finger, its smudge darker today, as if from recent writing. Eliza's turn came last, her defiance flaring. "I was in the village by 9, I told you," she snapped. "I left leaflets, yes, but I didn't go near Renaud's room. A scarf with a floral stain? I've never seen it. My rucksack's full of papers, not trinkets." Her voice rose, but her hands betrayed her, twisting the hem of her jacket, where Miss Marple glimpsed a patched pocket, bulging slightly as if holding a small tin. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind racing. Clara's fidgeting, Dimitri's tremor, Sir Harold's strained smile, Eliza's rising panic. Each was a tell, but Eliza's reaction to the scarf was sharpest. The guilty, Miss Marple thought, fear the smallest detail. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Poacher, whose lie had collapsed when asked about a single feather, his panic undoing him. To press further, Miss Marple spoke, her voice gentle but pointed. "Miss Kane, your leaflets are quite passionate. I found one with a silk thread caught in its fold, much like the scarf's weave. Could it have come from your rucksack? Perhaps during your time in the courtyard?" Eliza's eyes widened, her defiance faltering. "A thread? That's nothing. I handle all sorts of papers. Threads get caught. It doesn't mean I touched that scarf." Her voice cracked, and her hand went to her pocket, a gesture so quick it might have gone unnoticed, but not by Miss Marple. Crane pounced, his tone sharp. "Miss Kane, empty your pockets, now." Eliza hesitated, her face flushing, then pulled out a small tin from her jacket. It was a battered thing, its label worn, but when opened, it released a faint floral scent, sharp like the scarf stain. "It's just balm," she stammered. "For my hands. I've had it for months, bought it abroad, in Istanbul." Her words tumbled out too fast, and Miss Marple saw the trap snap shut. The other suspects shifted, their own nerves evident. Clara's hands stilled, Dimitri's tapping ceased, Sir Harold's smile tightened. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her thoughts weaving the final pattern. The scarf's weave, the floral balm, Eliza's presence near the west wing. They pointed to a protester whose zeal had turned deadly. Yet Clara's ink, Dimitri's cufflinks, Sir Harold's ambition lingered in her mind, their contradictions unresolved. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Baker, whose theft was exposed by a single crumb, his motive clear only when cornered. As the suspects were dismissed, Crane turned to Miss Marple, his voice low. "You've got her rattled, Miss Marple. That bomb, it's too close to the scarf stain. But the others? They're hiding something too." Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene. "The trap, Inspector, catches more than one mouse. Eliza's panic is telling, but the others' masks are slipping too. We're close now." She recalled a saint, Mary Mead widow, who had confessed when pressed with a single question, her guilt laid bare by her own fear. The manor pulsed with the summit's fragile hope, its delegates wary of collapse. Miss Marple returned to her window, her knitting a steady companion. The trap had been set, and Eliza's reaction had lit the spark. The truth, she knew, was moments away. A silken thread, a floral stain, a lie exposed in the heat of scrutiny. Chapter 12. The Protesters' Fall. The grand drawing-room of Lord Ashby's manor glowed with the soft light of chandeliers, their crystals casting delicate patterns across the polished oak floor. The summit, though battered by the murder of Ambassador Victor Renaud, clung to its purpose. The delegates gathered for an evening session that felt more like a vigil. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting, let her needles move in their gentle rhythm, her pale blue eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity. The trap she had set with Inspector Crane had stirred the suspects, and now, with the threads of evidence woven tight, she was ready to unveil the truth. The air was thick with anticipation, the delegates' voices subdued as they awaited Crane's next move. He stood by the fireplace, his notebook tucked away, his expression one of grim resolve. Miss Marple had shared her deductions earlier that day, piecing together the scarf's stain, the timeline's gaps, and the motive's masks. The room held Clara Henshaw, Dmitri Volkov, Sir Harold Bryce, and Eliza Kane, each positioned like players in a final act, their faces a study in tension. Clara clutched her notebook, Dimitri's fingers tapped restlessly. Sir Harold's smile was a brittle veneer, and Eliza's defiance seemed to waver, her eyes darting to the exits. "Ladies and gentlemen," Crane began, his voice cutting through the murmur. "The murder of Ambassador Renaud was no random act. It was deliberate, driven by a motive rooted in the summit's stakes. We've heard your accounts, tested your alibis, and now, with Miss Marple's insight, we know the truth." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze settling on Eliza, whose hands twisted the hem of her jacket. "Miss Kane," Crane continued, "you claim to have left for the village by 9, but witnesses place you near the west wing at 9:15, slipping through the gate with leaflets. One bore a silk thread, matching the scarf that strangled Renaud, a scarf from Istanbul, where your group protested last year." Eliza's face paled, her voice sharp but unsteady. "That's nothing. Threads get caught. Leaflets are messy. I didn't touch him." Her hand went to her pocket, where the tin of floral balm had been found, its scent a damning echo of the scarf's stain. Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of certainty. "Miss Kane, your passion for your cause is admirable, but it blinded you. You slipped into Renaud's suite, not to kill, but to plant documents, leaflets perhaps to expose what you saw as corruption. He caught you, didn't he? A struggle ensued, and in your desperation, you used the scarf, a memento from your travels, kept in your rucksack to silence him." Eliza's eyes widened, her defiance crumbling. "No, I didn't mean—" Her voice broke, and she sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. "He grabbed me, threatened to call the guards. I panicked. The scarf was there, in my bag. I just wanted him quiet, not dead." Her words spilled out, a confession wrung from fear and guilt. Crane nodded, his expression grim. "You acted alone, Miss Kane, driven by zeal to disrupt the summit. The bomb in your pocket left its mark on the scarf, tying you to the crime." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind satisfied but alert. Clara's trembling hands, Dimitri's wary eyes, Sir Harold's tight smile. They had all played their parts, their contradictions sowing doubt. Clara's resentment had been real but impotent, Dimitri's secrets tied to his own ambitions, Sir Harold's opportunism a shadow of his charm. Only Eliza's passion had crossed the line, her act a desperate bid to shatter the summit's fragile peace. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead activist whose fervor had led to arson, her regret coming too late. "Passion," Miss Marple murmured, "is a fire that consumes judgment." The scarf, the thread, the bomb, all had pointed to Eliza, her motive laid bare by her own panic. Crane signaled to the constable, who stepped forward to lead Eliza away. Her defiance was gone, replaced by a hollow resignation as she was escorted from the room. The delegates watched in silence, their relief tempered by the summit's uncertain future. Sir Harold cleared his throat, his voice too loud in the quiet. "We must press on," he said, "for peace." But his smile faltered under Miss Marple's steady gaze. As the room emptied, Crane approached Miss Marple, his notebook closed. "You saw it all, didn't you? The thread, the scent, the lies. I'd have missed half of it." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "People are predictable, Inspector, if you watch their small habits. In my village, a single word can unravel a crime. Here, it was a thread." She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Baker, whose theft was exposed by a crumb, his motive clear only in hindsight. The summit resumed, its delegates shaken but resolute. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the fire's glow warm against her shawl. The truth had been unveiled, the scarf's secret laid bare. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead widow, whose confession had saved a family, her guilt a weight lifted by honesty. "The truth," Miss Marple murmured, "is always simpler than the lies that hide it." The manor settled into a fragile calm, the summit's hope rekindled. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind at rest, the pattern complete. The protester had fallen, and St. Mary Mead's quiet observer had woven the final thread.